Well, hello, good morning, Arizonans. We're awfully glad that you are with us today. We have quite an agenda of people to talk with you about the election overtime project that is being organized nationwide and particularly targeting resources that might be needed by reporters in 7 key states that are expected to have close contested or potentially disputed elections, and Arizona is one of those. And so for today's presentation, as you can see from the agenda in front of you, we have speakers across the political spectrum. That includes Republicans, Democrats, and independents who probably mightily disagree on policy matters, but who are absolutely united in their commitments to trusted elections in America. So we want to let you know that today we're going to be talking with you about the program, and that each of the speakers on the screen in front of you are all part of our Election Overtime Speakers Bureau. That means that not only are they giving you brief presentations today about a few things that they are each smart about, they are also available to support you in terms of interviews, election night coverage, post-election coverage as needed as the election season progresses. Just so you know, this is the second of roughly a dozen briefings between now and the inauguration of our next president. So we're excited to be talking with you about that. I'm Heather Ballas, and I'm the Vice President of the Election Reformers Network. And rather than talk much about me, I just wanted to quickly lift up the entire team of the Election Reformers Network, who has been working for months on the development of this program, and most particularly the development of the materials that we're going to share with you today. Like many of you, we wake up almost every day thinking about the future of our nation and the continuation of trusted elections in our democratic republic. And we believe that sound media coverage in America is the most critical factor in helping that happen. So, as I have said before, with humility, we offer our support to the hardworking election reporters of this nation and Arizona. And so here is what that support looks like. We have provided for you at electionovertime.com an online,
.org.
what's that?
.org, sorry.
Oh my goodness, electionovertime.org. Thank you. Appreciate the clarification. Electionovertime.org. This important online toolkit that contains a handful of really important resources, including state-specific partisan legal briefs that I'm going to give you a preview of today, the speakers bureaus that I already talked about, links to a whole host of additional election resources. We tried to not duplicate efforts, but lift up the great work of other people that are providing tools that might be helpful to you. These series of a dozen briefings, of which, as I mentioned, this is number 2. And then once we get to the election process, if there is litigation in Arizona or the other 7 states that are on your screen, we're also providing an online litigation tracker to help reporters be able to cover what's happening in the courts in real time. So that's in a nutshell what the Election Overtime Project is going to offer. And I also just very quickly want to share with you that we've organized our materials around these 3 key pillars for reporting on trusted elections. They're tied essentially to the 3 phases that we think about in the electoral process. The first being verification and transparency in the work. That includes all of the policies that surround how we do observation and validation of or observation of the work that's underway. We also have a whole pillar devoted to the verification process itself. And that verification process includes the ways that we can double check the accuracy of the results. And it has all of those procedures that are required by Arizona law so that the voters and you as reporters have confidence that that verification process is going according to plan. The third piece of these 3 pillars is judicial review. And history tells us that this is the area of the electoral process that the voters understand the least, and that not all reporters, but many journalists who don't have a legal background really sometimes struggle with this one part of the process. And so we've tried to provide you as many resources as we can to understand what's happening in judicial phases, knowing that the courts as an institution are the best tool we have to fairly hear evidence and render judgment when we have questions around the validity of an election. And so, having said that, I'll just quickly give you a heads up that the election policy briefs that we have produced for Arizona and the other states are intended to help reporters who are on deadline. We know for a fact that if you're on deadline, you don't have time to go through 400 pages of regs and statutes to try to determine what's actually occurring as it relates to, say, a certification practice or an observation policy. We interviewed reporters and election officials across the nation to figure out what you would most need to know and know quickly, and have boiled that down for you to what's roughly a 25-page policy brief, but displayed on our website into one quick screen. And I'm going to just quickly give you a heads up that that's all organized for you as reporters into these key questions. And they look like they're pretty simple and straightforward, but for each of them, we've given you as much detail as we can. And along the way have provided a lot of citation so that you can see where we received our information and can fact check us along the way. And so, having said all of that, I'm turning us back to our slide deck here, and am going to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Kevin Johnson, who's the executive director of the Election Reformers Network. He's going to share with you a little bit more about this program. You should know that he's the founder of the Election Reformers Network, and has since 2017 led extensive research and advocacy work for our charity. He also has decades of experience, not just in America, but across the globe in terms of emerging democracies and election observation. So with that, Kevin, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, everyone. It is really great to be here. I noted in the list of journalists attending some folks who do excellent reporting that I've been reading for years. So it's an honor to be with you and an honor to be with this great panel. I'm Kevin Johnson, Executive Director of ERN, and I'm really proud of the Election Overtime Project. There's, as you can tell by the name, there's a sports analogy behind the Overtime Project, and I get to explain that because Heather, who does many things very well, doesn't speak sport. Sports, of course, go into overtime, and being from Massachusetts, I picked this picture here to share the image of a game won in overtime, an image that I happen to like, but I know lots of other people hate, including many of my good friends from the Carter Center in Atlanta, where the Falcons are from. But hate it or lose it, no one disputes the score. And this is true in sports across our land. Fans agree on the result in part because they really understand the rules very well, including some very complicated rules about how overtime works and difference in overtime in the regular season versus the playoff season in some sports, how rulings by referees can be challenged. There are a million 9-year-olds who know that every touchdown in the NFL is automatically reviewed in a video room and before it's finally certain. And that's why it says under review on the screen here. And kind of the question that we want to pose in a way is, wouldn't it be great if American voters came to know as much about the rules of elections as 9-year-old sports fans know about the rules of football? Frame the aspiration that way. And you think about where they learn from commentators who repeat over and over, this is how it works. And that's kind of what we're trying to get more and more information about the structures and the rules. We might think readers might be bored, but in reality, there's a real value to the order and protection against chaos that comes from knowing the rules. So an encouragement to dive into rule-based reporting, as many of you already do and do very, very well. Going on to the next slide, I want to give an example of how both sides get the facts wrong, and in so doing, kind of increase doubt about the process. This is an interview from Adam Kinzinger, who is a hero to one side anyway at this point, in which he says that there is a potential for a constitutional crisis because it's the Republican legislature that's responsible in Arizona for certifying presidential results. And what if they refuse? That'll start a crisis. Many of you in this room, I'm sure, know that it isn't the legislature that certifies the results in Arizona, and that, in fact, once election day comes, state legislatures across the country have no role in presidential results. State results in Arizona are certified by Secretary Fontes, and then the certificate of ascertainment, it's called, which is specific to the presidential election, is issued by the governor. You know, Adam Kinzinger got this wrong, and his interviewer got this wrong. And it turns out 63% of Americans also said it was true that state legislatures certify presidential results. And we know that because at ERN, we just fielded a snappy little poll probing on the knowledge of election rules. And this next slide, this slide shows a quick snapshot of that. We're going to be releasing this very soon. A lot of interesting findings. Bottom line, as summarized here, is voters don't know the rules as well as they should. Those who know the rules better are more, feel more confident about that the election in 2024 will go well. And when you compare voters who know the rules well with those who don't, there is not a difference by party, by demographic background, or even by media source. So both sides are not doing as well as they could in terms of explaining the rules. So that's a quick summary of our quick sneak peek into survey data we'll be sharing to you. And then I'll hand it back to you, Heather. Thank you very much.
Very good. So we're excited about that data that Kevin presented, and we will be issuing a press release that summarizes that information, we hope by the end of the week. So stay tuned. If you're registered for this event, you will receive that data as quick as it's available. In the meanwhile, our next presenter is Don Henninger, who is a former journalist, a really well-known civic leader in New Mexico, and not only a former managing editor of the Arizona Republic, but in his current life is, among other things, the co-chair of the Arizona Democracy Resilience Network, and that's a group that we partner with a lot because both of our projects are supported by the Carter Center. So Don, let me turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Heather. You know, I'm actually from Arizona, not New Mexico, but there are days when I wish I was in New Mexico. Trust me. I really appreciate that. But, you know, like you said, I've spent almost 4 decades as a journalist in the newspaper industry here in Arizona. And we had our fair share of challenges along the way. And when I look back at the reporting we did to serve our communities, you know, it was a time when newspapers and legacy media were strong, trusted sources of information. And the internet and social media were just getting off the ground. And today, when I look ahead, I see a role for journalism that is even more important to the health of our communities and maybe to the very future of our democracy. The job that journalists do today have never been more important, and it's never been more difficult. The most important tool we have is to build trust in our elections and to prevent political unrest is sound, accurate, and timely reporting. The threat of violence that we face today is very real. We've seen intimidation at ballot drop boxes. We've seen a Democrat campaign office now shot at 2 weeks in a row. Real bullets in the windows. Mark Fincham appeared this month on the QAnon podcast Patriot Street Fighter. The Proud Boys are active in meetings throughout the state. I could go on and on. The list is long. But that's why I really appreciate the work that the ERN is doing to help journalists navigate through the clutter of all this mis and disinformation, all the legal and technical challenges that can make your head spin. These are complex issues, and dealing with them, especially on tight deadlines, is a huge challenge for sure. It's all become very complicated, often hard to tell the difference between fact and fiction. and challenging to understand the nuances of all the legal angles, the laws and regulations that run our system until recent times have not been questioned like they are today. You know, already there have been more than 90 lawsuits filed across the country challenging the elections, and we're still a month out. I worry more sometimes about what's going to happen after November 5th than I am what's going to happen before then. It's one of the reasons I'm also working with the Arizona Democracy Resilience Network. This is a program that was launched by the Carter Center 3 years ago. The Carter Center, which was created by former President Jimmy Carter, has been doing work to sustain democracies across the globe for decades. And after the 2020 elections, they realized that maybe the biggest threat to democracy was right here in our own backyards. So they created networks in 6 states: Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. I'm the Republican co-lead. Ron Barber of Tucson, who you'll hear about from just a minute from now, is my left-leaning co-lead. We've been working together now for almost 3 years, largely getting ready for the election that's now just about 5 weeks away. Our network is made up of about 250 business, community, and faith leaders from across the state. The whole idea is for us to address concerns about how our election processes have been impacted by the threats of violence, and acts of violence, actually, the virtual elect statements, and the loss of democratic norms. Our mission is to help restore confidence in our elections. We believe that the vast majority of Arizonans share these concerns, and they'll respond favorably to credible and trusted messengers who are working to restore democratic values and also to mitigate any kind of potential political violence. We meet twice a month via Zoom to educate them on election processes, share facts where needed, and to train our members on media literacy and rapid response to the public when we encounter bad information. We'll be working to support the safety of election workers and voters as well. The ADRN leans a little bit left for several reasons, much of which are tied to the Carter Center, which is former President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. But we have Republicans in the network, but it's been a little bit more challenging to recruit them. But there are a lot of moderate Republicans and right-leaning independents right now who feel like they don't belong to the current Republican Party and are left pretty much out there on their own. And that became very visible to a few of us this past spring. The Agora Institute out of Johns Hopkins University and R Street, 2 national conservative groups, along with the McCain Institute, held a day-long meeting of moderate Republican leaders to talk about how conservatives can work together to ensure our democracy. And it was extremely helpful and productive. But it was also just a day-long meeting. And after it was over, a few of us saw a chance to build on the momentum of that meeting, and we formed a new conservative group called the Conservative Agenda for Arizona. It's a collaborative network to the ADRN. I serve as board chairman for that. This group is mobilizing conservatives across Arizona to educate members on core issues, including work to build trust in our election systems among Republicans and independents. Our mission is to strengthen the conservative movement by fostering a well-informed, active, and unified community of trusted right-leaning leaders. And like the ADRN, we're working in support of fair, safe, and secure elections and to mitigate any potential political violence that we might encounter in the next few months. And unfortunately, like we said, in Arizona, as we've seen, the threat for political violence is very real. And with that positive note, I'll turn it back over to Heather.
Well, you say you're turning it over on a positive note, and my note's not very positive, I must confess, Dawn, and that is we do see around the country increasing concerns by voters regarding the risk of political violence. And so I share this example because it's not the only thing that the Democracy Resilience Network and the conservative group that Dawn just shared about. It's not the only thing they're working on, and it's not the only thing that we're working on with election overtime, but it is something that that people are concerned about. Now, I do not believe for 1 minute that because voters are worried about political violence, that that's necessarily predictive of the reality that political violence could occur. But what is worrisome about this particular survey, which is a CBS data that came out just last week, is that not only are they concerned that we'll see an increase in political violence over the coming years, but that in this particular election, voters fear political violence no matter who wins. And so that's not predictive, but that represents a growing worry. And it points to the reality that we do need to find lots of ways to be educating our electorate around what is good behavior in an electoral process. And then how do we understand if the electoral processes are working? So Congressman Ron Barber is going to talk with us a little bit about some of those activities. And we just want to say thank you to him for his service in the U.S. House of Representatives, the service that he provided in the wake of the assassination attempt on Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, and the reality that he continues to provide important civic leadership in Arizona, including through our Democracy Resilience Network. So, Ron, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about a couple more things, including the principles for trusted elections.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Kevin, and everybody who's involved with the Election Reformers Network. I really appreciate you organizing this webinar and gathering a bunch of folks who really know a lot about what's going on electorally. Before I go through the principles, I just want to say a few things about Arizona and the sort of the big picture, if you will. We have become, unfortunately, ground zero for a lot of threats and violence. And the way we know that is not only because it's reported in the news and we have people in our network who can report what they've been experiencing or seeing in their area of the state, but because, back in 22, after the election, there was an effort by the Arizona Senate to question the results of the election, and they organized an audit, which came to be known as a fraudit because of how poorly it was organized. In fact, it ended up showing that President Biden got more votes than the election results showed. So anyway, that's part of the problem. We've got some history here. But the other part of our history related to violence or threats of violence has to do with the number of election leaders and volunteers. Because of what happened in 22 in terms of threats towards election officials, 12 out of 15 counties in Arizona have lost their election officials. That means either the recorder who puts together the ballot or the election director who manages the elections. It includes, in some cases, both of them resigning. And the reason? They're sick and tired of being under threat, and their families too. And so we've lost a lot of institutional knowledge based upon real fear of what might happen in 2024. I also wanted to say a few words again before we go into the principles. The largest county population-wise in Arizona is Maricopa County. That's where state capital is. And we've seen some really serious attempts there to rattle people, to intimidate people. For example, in 22, we had people in camo and long guns monitoring, if you will, the election drop boxes. They were intimidating the people, dropping their ballots off. They followed them out of the parking lot. They took pictures of them and their license plate. Eventually, a judge intervened and pushed them so far back from the election drop boxes that their intimidation was no longer effective, and they hung it up. But it is a problem that we've had some real history. It's not speculation. It's based upon facts. The threats of political violence in Arizona, unfortunately, go back. And Heather mentioned the attempted assassination of Congressman Gabby Giffords. I was her district director when that happened in 2011. Was standing beside her when the shooting started. I saw her get shot in the head and go down, and then the next thing I know, I was shot twice and I was down. And then 6 people died that day, and 13 more, including myself and Congresswoman Giffords, thankfully survived. But we're carrying a lot of physical and emotional experiences and problems from that time. However, that is a motivator, at least for me, in terms of trying to make sure that voters know exactly what's going on. So let me now talk to the 5 principles, which were developed by the Carter Center for all of our network members and all of the states that were involved. They have to do with, 1, promoting an honest process, meaning that we want we want people who are candidates to cooperate with election officials, adhere to the rules and regulations, and really importantly, refrain from knowingly propagating falsehoods about the election process. We need their help to support safety and security of elections and not to participate in spreading falsehoods. We also encourage, the second principle, we encourage people to have nonviolent campaigns. And unfortunately, we've seen threats of violence, at least, but we've also seen other more serious attempts at threatening people and actually acting on threats. So we want our candidates to respect voters' freedom to exercise their lawful rights and to be free from obstruction or intimidation. We also want to make sure that the public knows that we have secure elections. We did back in 22 in Phoenix and in Tucson, election process forums with the Secretary of State's office involved, the local recorder involved, local election directors. And what happened there was, I think all of us, including myself and Don, we saw how complicated and the election processes are across 2 offices at the county level. And we want to make sure that we're publicly affirming and that candidates are publicly affirming the integrity of elections and avoid fueling doubt about elections in other jurisdictions. We've seen what that does. We've seen a rise in distrust of the election processes. But after those 2 public meetings, anyone who attended would have to say it's not possible to have massive fraud because of the checks and balances. The 4th principle has to do with responsible oversight, and that's where we want and hope that political parties and others train poll watchers in a very responsible way to act as nonpartisan players in the election process. And the last one has to do with trusted outcomes. You know, I have a personal experience with this, which I'll share momentarily, but yes, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Heather. It's back up, and not the last one is not back up, but we want to make sure that claims of election irregularities are done in accordance with the law, and that what the outcome is finalized, that the loser and the winner accept the outcome. So let me tell you about my own personal experience with this. In 2014, I was running for re-election. I lost the general election by 167 votes out of 250,000 votes cast. So that was a real challenge for both myself and my opponent. We went into an automatic recount, which lasted quite a long time. We both lawyered up, and one of the things that we did in my campaign was to take our concerns about the count to the federal bench. And what we were presenting were 135 cured ballots. Cured ballots, you may know, are ballots that maybe have a minor piece missing, like a signature or a date or whatever, a phone number. And you can actually go out and talk to the voter and say, would you mind fixing this? And a lot of them did. So we had 135 of those. And we had more in process, about another 100. But the judge ruled that since we didn't present enough votes to show, cured ballots to show that I'd won, that they should go forward, the count should go forward. So we had a choice at that point. I mean, it's a pretty big deal when a federal judge tells you you're done. It happened on Thanksgiving morning, which is also curious. So the consultants that were on board for us and the people in Democratic Party leadership at the national level said, go on to the Ninth Circuit, where they will probably be more favorably disposed. It was my decision to make, and I said no. By then, it was almost January. At this point, we did not have a certified election winner, and it was just going to tie things up, seemed like, for a long time. The people of Arizona deserve to have a representative from our part of the state. And so it was my decision, despite all of the pressure I got, to say no. When you lose, and you should say so. We might have won, but it just was another delay in a process where I felt, the time was come to say we had lost. And so that's what we did, against the advice and encouragement of many national Democratic leaders. So we have these 5 principles, which we have given to candidates and given to people who support candidates, and certainly given to our network. And we're encouraging people. We're not saying endorse these, because endorsement would take us out of our nonprofit appropriate way of doing business. So we're asking people to look at them, to consider them, hopefully to be guided by them. So I'll finish with that, Heather, and thank you again for all you've done to put this together.
No worries. One thing that I would add is that people can sign an online form that demonstrates their support for these 5 principles. And they can do that at the website principlesfortrustedelections.org. Again, that's principlesfortrustedelections.org. And I think the main takeaway from Congressman Barber's observations is that it's really easy to be principled when you win. It's not so easy to be principled when you don't. And we need our lawmakers to do both. So, having said that, our next speaker is Senator Ken Bennett, who's a current member of the legislature, a former Secretary of State for Arizona, and who understands deeply the activities of how our elections are administered, having administered, we believe, more statewide and multi-jurisdictional elections than any other Arizona Secretary of State alive. So we've got an expert here to help us sort some of these things out. So, Senator Bennett, you've got the floor, sir. And you're muted.
There we go. Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be part of ERN. Thank you to you and Kevin and many others that have put this together. I'm honored to appear along with friends Ron and Don. And in fact, I was the Secretary of State when Ron's recount occurred back in 2014. And, I really like Kevin's sports analogy. I'm a sports nut. And so we've become accustomed in sports to having decisions reviewed. And sometimes we have to wait a little longer than we want while the referee goes under the the hood or the cover or the whatever, to review. And there's other people up in a booth somewhere that we can't see that are participating. And then when that process works it out, we can tell by a toenail or a foot or a sliver of grass that, how the decision was made. Elections are not perfect because the people who run elections are not perfect people. And so errors can be made, but usually they are unintentional, and they do not change the outcome of an election. I thought, as I shared with Heather the other day, that maybe one of the most informative things that I could share today is my experience when I had become Secretary of State in 2009. The very next year was 2010. We had statewide elections. And one of the ballot measures that was on the ballot in 2010, after we counted almost 2 million votes statewide, this ballot measure was losing by 126 votes. And my Deputy Secretary of State, who is now a Maricopa County Superior Court judge, came into my office. I remember late in the afternoon, he said, "Secretary Bennett, we're going to have to, this is the first time in the history of Arizona that we've triggered the automatic recount statute, 200 votes for a statewide measure. This was less than that, first time in the history of the state." And as I was trying to go to sleep that night, it occurred to me that, okay, I'm going to have to call 15 county recorders, 15 county election directors tomorrow morning and tell them we got to get all the ballots back out of the boxes. We got to fire up enough machines to count them all. And we're going to have to recount about 2 million ballots. And being an accounting major and like my degree's in accounting and I like numbers, I started to think, and I laying there in bed, okay, if we're going to recount 2 million ballots, if we are 99% accurate between the first count and the second count, that's 20,000 out of 2 million is 99% on a race that was decided by 126. If we're 99.9% accurate, that's 2,000 out of 2 million. If we're 99.99% accurate in the second count compared to the first count, we could be off by 200 ballots in a race that was decided by 126. And I, as the then Secretary of State, might have to stand up and say, well, it didn't lose by 126, it won by 74. And so I did not get much sleep that night, thinking that we're going to have two counts, and if they were 99.99% accurate to each other, we could have a change in the election. Well, as the recount unfolded over the next week or 10 days, I was pleased that when 15 counties reported back their results of the recount, the result changed by 42 votes out of 2 million. Instead of losing by 126, it lost by 168. Well, I was curious as to even why did it change by 42? My staff and I reviewed the results from every one of the more than 1,500 precincts statewide. 99% of the precincts were spot on, no difference even by one vote between the first count and the second count. There were a few precincts that were off one here or off two. And all of a sudden we ran into one in Maricopa County, a change of 30 between the first count and the second count. And so I called the then county recorder and county election director. One happened to be Republican, one happened to be a registered Democrat. And I got the ladies on the phone. What happened in such and such precinct that the difference between these counts was 30 difference when the whole state, 1,500 precincts only changed by 42. That means all the other precincts combined only changed by 12. They called the people that worked the precinct that day. Finally, they got someone who admitted that about 11 o'clock in the morning, someone noticed that the little door had not been set correctly on the ballot tabulation machine, so that as the ballots fed through, instead of going down into the hopper, the ballots had gone out behind the back of the machine and were lying on the floor. And someone, out of being extra cautious and want to make sure that every vote is counted, they ran that handful of ballots on the floor through a second time on election day. And of course, they did not make that mistake when those ballots were counted in the recount. So we were able to explain how out of a 42 vote change in the whole state of Arizona, 30 of those changes occurred in one precinct, and we had an explanation as to how it did. So that has always given me comfort that errors can be made in elections. Usually they are, as I said, unintentional, and they're usually of a minor nature. Or Don, I think, or Ron, or one of them mentioned the audit of the Maricopa County presidential election back in 2020. I wasn't in charge of the audit, but I was asked by the Senate to kind of be a liaison, since I had been a senator and I had been a Secretary of State. And we hand counted 2.1 million ballots. No, it wasn't it was 2,089,563. We hand counted the votes for president and for U.S. Senator on 2,089,563 votes. And we came up with a result for the presidential candidates within 300 votes of what the county had told us the previous November. Joe Biden didn't win Maricopa County by 45,000. He won by 45,300. Now, Donald Trump won the rest of the state by 35,000. But when you net 35 and 45, President Biden won by about 10,000 votes. So elections are not perfect, because the people that run them are people, and we're fallible and we can make mistakes. But there's nothing wrong, just like in sports. I can remember watching an NFL game the other couple of weeks ago, where a game tying touchdown occurred in the back of the end zone. They initially called it a touchdown. When they reviewed it and went over a snapshot of a picture that they got to look at 45 times, whereas the referee had to make a call in a half a second, they noticed that the toe was barely on the white line and it was disallowed. So there's nothing wrong with verifying results. And I think one of the things that I hope to be a part of as part of the Election Overtime Project, Election Reformers Network, is to give especially reporters and people that report to the public what's going on in elections, data that they can trust. I think in an earlier slide it said that I might be talking about how do you know when election, when there might be a problem going on in elections, especially if it includes a national race and you're in a swing state like Arizona, right away, as results are starting to come out or not coming out, or some counties are coming out quicker than other counties, people intrinsically know that things can maybe be going awry here or there. We're very decentralized in Arizona. The state does not run the election. Each of the 15 counties run the elections. And so when one county's results come out faster than another, there's usually a reason, and it's important to know the right reasons and the facts instead of people making guesses and suggesting things that create distrust in our elections.
Great. Senator Bennett, thank you so much for that overview and that specific example, because I think it is really helpful for us to hear some of the nitty-gritty about how we can answer the questions that come to us by fellow voters and others. So I am going to remind folks in our audience that you can be teeing up questions in the Q&A, and you don't have to wait till the end to be doing that. So feel free to be adding those along this discussion. Next up, I would like us to turn to Jackie Salet. And so when Senator Bennett said, you know what, sometimes you win by a hair, you win by just the smallest amount, we know that sometimes that small margin of victory is determined by unique and distinct sets of voters. So Jackie is an expert on the independent voter and is a 30-year veteran on the independent reform movement, independent voter reform movement. And she does that both through her work as the president of independentvoting.org and also as a researcher with Arizona State. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Jackie, and let all of our panelists know we're running a tiny bit over. So if we can compress our time just a bit, then I think we can give our audience time for some questions too. So it's all yours, Jackie.
All right, great. Thank you, Heather, and thank you, ERN, for all the work here. I'm going to be very quick. This is part of what I think we're trying to look at here is as if there's a contested situation and as the certification process is moving forward and engaging whatever roadblocks are coming up along the way, the story of the different coalitions that assembled behind the candidates, we think is an important part of the story. And so here, I just want to highlight for you the whole question of the independent voter in Arizona and nationally. Very, very briefly here, independents as a whole have chosen the last 3 presidents of the United States. They broke for Barack Obama by 8 points in 2008. For Trump by 4 points in 2016 and by 13 points in 2020 for the Biden-Harris ticket. In 2020, Arizona independents broke for Biden by 9 points. And I would also highlight the fact that independents just at the registration level are 1/3 of the electorate in Arizona. They overperform in general election voting, and in the last presidential election, independents were 40% of the electorate in Arizona. And so the expectation here is that in 2024, in roughly a month, the independent vote will turn out to be key. Some things just to flag you on from a coverage point of view is that Edison Research, in conjunction with the National Election Pool, will be doing exit polling on the presidential race and on statewide races all across the country. And that includes, of course, the state of Arizona. And Reuters is the news organization that will be responsible for distributing the results of the exit polling. So we will be able to see in fairly short order what the turnout of independents was and what the alignment of independent voters was. And we think that that's potentially an important part of, if you will, the sub-story, if there is a contested situation in Arizona and in other parts of the country. Something just to observe, though, about the Arizona situation is that currently poll watching observers are allowed only as appointees of the two major parties. So you are likely going to have a major constituency in the state that is also potentially dispositive relative to the results of the election that has no representation, formally speaking, inside the polling sites. And this is something that at the ASU Center for an Independent and Sustainable Democracy, we're looking at very closely and is an issue that might be of interest to reporters. I would add also, just again, to flag you on what I'm sometimes calling sub-stories here, is that one of the things that we're seeing in pre-election polling is the phenomena of ticket splitting. And so, for example, in the current polling in Arizona, we're seeing a very slight edge at the presidential level for former President Donald Trump. We're also seeing in the general polling a fairly significant edge for the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate, Ruben Gallego. And I would say that the latest polling on the Lake Gallego race shows Gallego with a support of 64% of independents as compared with 32% of independents for Lake. So that's a very, very large differential. All of this to say, the story of the independent vote in Arizona, I think, is going to be quite important. And something, again, just to ask reporters to keep your eye on, because the exit polling organizations are doing presidential and statewide only, they will not be exit polling the Maricopa County Recorder race, which is a potentially very important race in terms of the future of democratically conducted elections in the state of Arizona. So if those of you that are in a position to push for that can do that through your news organizations, that would be great. And I'll kick it back to you, Heather. Thanks.
All right, very good. Well, so when we think about all of that, all of the different types of information we've been hearing, one of the things that we know is that whether it's the information about independent voters or information around the degree to which we are presenting information to our constituencies so that they understand how the elections work or how recounts work, we know that the newsrooms have to have the capacity to do that work. And Jenny Flynn is one of a handful of philanthropists across the country that are investing in small and nonprofit newsrooms to try to help them have the capacity to do just that. So Jenny, in your capacity as the home of the local news initiative in Southern Arizona, we want to turn things over to you to talk a little bit around what you are seeing in terms of needs of local newsrooms and the ways in which this activity and this project might fit into that.
Sure. Thank you, Heather. And thanks to the Election Reformers Network for hosting this. Very briefly, we at the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona are the home to the Local News Initiative, which is also a chapter of the National Press Forward movement, which is a larger national movement to support local news and information. And we're really happy to do that because we know that the causes that we care about, donors and nonprofits care about in Southern Arizona, whether it's health or the environmental sustainability or education, require an informed community. And we have quite a bit of data to show that the loss of local news coverage, which is something that we've been facing, it really degrades our civic society and civic engagement. It leads to an increase in government corruption, lower bond ratings, and an increase in political polarization. So as a community foundation, our goal is to flip that and have a thriving community. So we've decided to go ahead and invest in local news, even though that's not a typical thing that you invest in as a philanthropist. We launched last November. We held our first grant round in March, and it was really, really clear from the applications that we received, which were totaled over 1.2 million, and we were only able to support 225,000 of that, that the needs are very much for staffing and capacity building. So we understand that unfortunately, at the same time that democracy is facing the challenges that we have, local news is facing kind of a business model crisis, resulting in layoffs and fewer people covering this important set of issues. So we're doing our part, I think, to go ahead and provide some support. And we recognize, support comes in many ways. One is dollars. The other is other kinds of resources. So I very much hope that you reporters on the call will use and spread the word about the election overtime materials, leverage those, take advantage of the materials and the Speakers Bureau with all the incredibly informed and central folks on this call. And I also, just as a footnote, want to share that the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona is already a signatory on the Principles for Trusted Elections. So it's been a cause that we've cared about for some time. And I'll turn it back to you, Heather.
That's great. We actually love it when we hear of groups that have already signed on to the Principles for Trusted Elections, which I do want to mention something that didn't come up already. The Principles for Trusted Elections, as well as the Election Overtime Project, are both supported by three groups actually. Carter Center, which has already been mentioned. On the Republican side, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation is also a sponsor of both of those initiatives. And then for Election Overtime, a third sponsor of those initiatives is the Bridge Alliance, which is the publisher of the Fulcrum. And on my screen, you're going to see a screenshot of this online publication. It's essentially an online newspaper specifically focusing on election and governance matters. I want to let you know that they have created a sort of a hashtag, a collection for the Election Overtime Project of articles and editorials that newsrooms are welcome to reprint. And so there's a whole collection of materials that you as reporters have available to you already. Additionally, as you do your terrific reporting, you can submit those pieces for consideration to the Election Overtime collection to potentially be reprinted for your colleagues for use in other ways. There's a handful of events that are coming up, and we hope that you all will take a look at the website and think about joining us for some of those. And there will be additional national events as we get a little bit farther along. But now what I want to do is quickly turn to some of the questions that we've been receiving in the chat. And there's one of them in particular, Senator Bennett, that you've started to answer in the chat, but I'm going to ask if we can elaborate on a little bit here in the big room. And that is the question regarding whether there's anything that we wanted to fix in Arizona election law that didn't get fixed and that we're worried about in this cycle. Can you talk about that a little bit, sir, and maybe elaborating on what you've already put in the chat?
Well, I believe very strongly that we can increase the confidence of our elections by having more transparency, trackability, and public verifiability. And so I have been trying through legislation and other efforts to either require or allow the ballot images and what's called the cast vote record to be published. I've I talked to some counties around the state, including the one I'm here in Yavapai County. They want, in the worst way, to release the ballot images after checking to make sure that there's no personally identifying information on any of the ballots, but and also redacting, if necessary, any very small precincts where there's only 1 or 2 voters in that precinct, and therefore you would know how that particular voter voted. But having done that, I just feel very strongly, but it's controversial and has not been able to get the votes from well, we got it through the legislature, but it was vetoed last year by the governor. But kind of back to that sports analogy, play under review. If there's a very close play in sports, we review it. And to me, the best way we could review elections is to have the ballot images, which are anonymous, redact those that have, if somebody, happens to write their name or cell phone number or something on their ballot, we can redact those things or whatever it takes. But to me, the greatest transparency that we could have and the greatest play under review analogy in elections would be publish the ballot images that are anonymous and the cast vote record, which is the spreadsheet where all the votes were added up on those ballots. And you could look at ballot number 692 and see that there's a vote in this race for Smith, a vote in this race for Jones, and a vote in this race for Garcia. And you can go to the cast vote record and go to row 692 and see that the system recorded votes for Smith and Jones and Garcia in their respective races. You could do that for one or all the ballots and add up the columns for each candidate, make sure that each county reported the correct number of votes for each ballot. But Jen Fifield, I can see here from VoteBeat, was already kind of tagging me for that idea, because we haven't been able to get that through and agreed legislatively and with the governor's signature to do that. But that is something that I was desperately hoping would be in place for this November. Somebody is going to lose one of the high-profile races in Arizona, president or U.S. senator. Someone's going to lose by a hair again, in my opinion. And I think we could do the public no better service than to be able to just publish the ballot images county by county or however they want to look at it to verify that the votes were correct.
Thank you very much, Senator. I was thinking we might pop in one more question, but what we're going to do instead is circulate some answers to some of those questions after the event, and we're going to do that on we'll do that via email to the registrants. One thing I want to do as we close is share with the reporters that are in the audience room, of which there's about a dozen over there. So we're grateful for your engagement with us today. Is a page that is on the Election Reformers Network's Election Overtime website. These are critical things that we have identified that voters really do need to know, and that our data is predicting that they don't know. And so as you all are considering what you might be trying to write on in the electoral process side of the work, we just want to draw your attention to this list, which is available for you at electionovertime.org. So having said all of that, let me just conclude by letting you all know how very grateful we are for your engagement with this work. Kevin Johnson, do you have anything you want to add before I wrap us up?
No, just thank you. It is a great program and wonderful to hear all the presentations by everyone. And thanks for everyone who came and listened. We'll be following up with you.
That's right. And in the category of following up, if you registered for this event, you will receive updates from this program as new resources are made available on the electionovertime.org website. Additionally, if you know of other journalists that you believe could benefit from these materials, which we are doing our best to provide as rapidly as possible, I do urge you to send them to the website. They can add themselves as a recipient through a form that's right online. There's also a rapid response form specifically for reporters in which you can tell us that you're on deadline and what your question is. We will do our best to connect you with sources to help you get that done. So with that, it is our expectation that that this election will be trusted by the American public because of spectacular reporting from people like you. And it is also our expectation that we want to lean in to help you to the extent that that is appropriate and helpful to you. So thank you so much for your time, and to all of our speakers. This recording and all of the election overtime briefings will be available on the website. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.